25-30, 35-40, 45-50, 45. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back. Auburn's going to win the football game.
They give it back now to the 30. They're down to the 20. Oh, the man is out on the field. He's going to go into the end zone.
Four-man Alabama rush. Got him. No, they didn't. Oh, my gracious.
Yep.
How about that?
Welcome back, everybody. Part 3, the final edition of our SEC preview here on the 3 Tech Pod. Of course, we're at the intersection of the X's and O's and the Jimmies and the Joes. Trey Reeves, Garrett Turney, I'm Mitch Mason. We're glad to have you back for this final edition of the SEC preview. If you have listened to the first 2 of this series, we're glad to have you to finish it off. If you are new to the show or to the channel for the first time through this episode, go on back, listen to parts 1 and 2, and we'd love if you would hit subscribe. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers on Twitter, on YouTube, and on our podcasting platforms as well. We'd love to have you join us for the season. Guys, we have the final 5 teams power ranked by our listeners who filled out a survey a couple of months ago, I guess really 1 month ago, and Missouri lands at number 5 on this list. Now, to set the stage, LSU was number 6. Tennessee was number 7. Those are the traditional, kind of white-collar members of the SEC, right? Teams that you expect to be up inside the top 5. But it is a reigning Cotton Bowl champion in Missouri, Trey, that takes spot number 5 on this list. 11-2 a season ago, and they've got a ton of momentum heading into 2024.
Yeah, a ton of momentum, a ton of guys back, especially on the offensive side of the ball. It all starts with the wide receiver core, Theo Weiss and Luther Burden leading that wide receiver core. Maybe one of the top 1-2 tandems at the wide receiver position in the entire country. Luther Burden was my first-round draft pick in our college football fantasy draft for a reason. He is just an absolute stud and has a very good chance to be the first wide receiver off the board. And yeah, 1,200 yards, 9 touchdowns, 86 receptions last year. Just a ton of fun to watch. And Brady Cook is back to lead the offense as well from the quarterback position. Really the only big skill position piece they lost on that side of the ball was Cody Schrader, the awesome story at running back, but everybody else is back to run it back. The real question mark for me is, they reinforced the offensive line. They need to replace some guys there. They got Marcus Bryant from SMU, Caden Green from Oklahoma. But the big question for me is the defensive side of the ball. They lost 3 top 3 NFL draft picks, top 3 round NFL draft picks on that side of the ball last year. It was a really talented unit. Not only did they lose that, we talked about it on the last episode, but they also lost their defensive coordinator to LSU. So that's going to be the story to me. If the defense can pick up where it left off, I have no questions about the offense. I think it's going to be fine. It's going to be explosive. The run game will be fine. They got Nate Noel from App State, Marcus Carroll from Georgia State. So nice additions there, but the defense is going to have to take a step, not a step up, but it's just not going to be able to lose steam. If the defense can hold pat, not lose any momentum from last year, even though they lost 3 absolute studs in the NFL draft, then I'm going to be really encouraged about Mizzou and maybe buy into some of the people that were picking them to go to the SEC championship game at Media Days.
They finished 34th in the country in total defense a season ago, just 1 spot in front of Texas, evidently. But you're right. This defense, remember just a couple years ago, this defense was the laughingstock of the conference. They were like one of the worst rush defenses in college football history. They couldn't stop a nosebleed. And then Blake Baker really turns the tide as Eli Drinkwitz gets better athletes into that program. They start to buy in. But you're right, kind of a late exit for Baker in the coaching carousel, right? Heads to LSU late in the process. It was thought that there was nobody that was going to pry him out of Como because other teams had certainly made a run at him to get him on their staff. He decides to go to LSU late. They do have some really fun new pieces joining them on the defensive side. I'm excited about Toriano Pride Jr. coming over from Clemson. names that right? These are brand names that you're going to find on this Missouri defense. Can they get started early, get their feet under them in those first 4 games, and then it's super advantageous for Missouri because their first true road trip, their first road trip away from Faro Field is off a bye week. They go to Texas A&M, but they get a week to prepare for that.
It's not
Then
till October 5th.
Exactly. They come back to play Auburn. They have a weird road trip up to UMass, which is hilarious.
Weirdest game on the entire college football schedule.
Yeah. Early homecoming against Auburn, and then they play Alabama. But again, we talked about in the last episode, really convenient bye weeks, especially to kind of get ready for big games. Obviously, you're not going to have the extra time to prepare for Auburn or for Alabama, but then you get a bye week to prepare for Oklahoma and finish out your season at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, home against Arkansas. This is a very, very gentle schedule for one of the hottest teams in the SEC. And I figure this is why our listeners had them in the top 5.
It's certainly why I have them up here. It's not the only reason. They're a very talented football team. Obviously, they proved it last year on the field. But yeah, they followed up with a very manageable schedule this year. Anytime you draw Vanderbilt, Mississippi State, and Arkansas in the SEC draw, you're going to be pretty happy with that, even with the Mississippi State game on the road. So I am really excited to see how many wins they can rack up this year. The swing games for me are A&M on the road and Auburn at home. I think if they can go 1-1 there, they're looking at a 10-2 season potentially. I think they're going to beat Oklahoma at home personally. I think they're going to be ready for that game. Obviously, things could change between now and November 9th, but as I'm sitting here in mid-July, I would pick Mizzou in that game at home against Oklahoma right now. So I think the season is really going to swing on at A&M and Auburn at home. If they can win one of those, if they can win both of them, that's amazing. But if they can just win one of those, they're right where they need to be.
I think Missouri is the next team up that gets to figure out if they can handle expectations, right? I mean, they've been doubted for so long. Even getting to a bowl game. I think our preview last year, we were just kind of ho-hum with them getting to a bowl game. The schedule was not easy, but we said we believe in Drink. He gets to 6-6, 7-5. This is what he does. He's found a way to win just enough, and then lo and behold, they reel off 11 wins, including a Cotton Bowl victory. So I want to say that they've been building kind of a resistance, right? A tolerance to expectations being slanted against them. And maybe that's just the resiliency that Drink has built within his program. We talked about the swing states last episode, how we framed those teams in the middle tier. For me, these are the teams that are the horses for courses. These are the teams that have been bred and groomed to make a championship run. And while Missouri may be surprising to some to see within the top 5 over an LSU, over a Tennessee, I look at their track record and I say, no, you know what? Like, they're ready to be here. They're ready for the moment. I feel like 9 wins is the floor for this Missouri team, and that might even be underachieving a little bit.
Yeah, and that the over-under is 9.5, and the betting public seems to think the under is the better bet right now. But I would lean towards the over right now because I think they're tough game. They have tough games at home. Oklahoma, Auburn, those swing games are at home. They go to A&M and Alabama. Those are 2 really tough road games, but we really aren't sure what A&M is going to be by October 5th. We think we know what Alabama is going to be this year, but they have a completely new staff. We'll talk about them in a minute. So why not Mizzou? That's the rallying cry.
Why not Mizzou? Fun team. They're going to be a blast to watch this year. If you like fun college football, tune in to watch Missouri. They're going to give it to you this season. Number 4 on this list is the Ole Miss Rebels, one of the dark horses to make the college football playoffs, certainly, but to make it to Atlanta this year. And without a doubt, all of that hype, again, coming off another wonderful time recruiting the transfer portal. And Garrett, Lane Kiffin really outdid himself this year. You look at top players at their positions, in the portal, and they pretty much all committed to Ole Miss, right? The offense, we know what you're going to get out of Jackson Dart, that wide receiver core. Quinshon Judkins does leave. He goes up to Ohio State, but man, Ole Miss, the lane train, they are rolling down the tracks. This year feels like they have to break through. They have to be able to win the physical battles in the trenches. And if they do that, I think not only do they have a great chance to make the playoff, but they have a great chance to be in Atlanta as well.
Yeah, and it's a great time to be a fan of the Ole Miss Rebs because you think about this. Lane Kiffin has them at the heights they've never seen before. First 11-win season they've ever had last year. They've done 10, I think 8 other times before that. And he's finally up here getting that first 11-win season, and he's doing it in a lot of right ways, right? Quarterback development, getting the most out of your role players, developing other players on the offensive side, and really playing a lot better on defense than they had been playing in more recent years, right? I know they had kind of the Land Sharks thing a little while back, but hadn't really been all that good under Kiffin to start, and now defense turning it around and really playing some good ball last year. If you're going to criticize them anywhere, it was going to be the lines of scrimmage, right? It's that they weren't really that dominant. They couldn't really get up there with the big boys at the highest levels of the SEC and play the same game. They did plenty fine against Penn State in the bowl game, but when you got up against guys like Georgia and Bama, they just really couldn't do it, right? When you look at what they were able to do in the lines of scrimmage, Ole Miss is probably one of the more slept on teams, I think, in the country. They could very well win the SEC this year for several reasons. Number one, I think Jackson Dart's a lot better than a lot of people are giving him credit for. You could say the same thing about Trey Harris. You could say the same thing about Ulysses Bentley. That these are guys that really played well last year. And I know people are going to point and say Quinshon Judkins left. Ulysses Bentley averaged 1.5 yards more per carry than Quinshon did last year. So Ulysses Bentley, if you think you're going to see this massive drop-off at the running back spot, think again. And I think that you're going to have a lot of success there. I like Caden Prescorn a lot, by the way, the tight end spot as well. I think they just have a litany of talent across their roster, but finally getting guys on the defensive line, finally getting guys in the offensive line that can really, step in and make a difference. And so when I ask the question, what can Ole Miss do this year? I don't think running the tables is completely out of the question. I mean, they have a really, really manageable schedule. It's a soft open. You don't really play a team you're scared of until you go to LSU, which obviously tough game. Anytime you go play at Baton Rouge, it's going to be a tough one. But, they get that game, I guess, what is that, 6 games into the season. So plenty of ramp-up time, plenty of time to get your guys where you want them to be for that game. You get a bye week, Oklahoma at Arkansas. You do play Georgia. And then they go another bye, then it's at Florida and then Mississippi State. Really, you're just kind of looking at that middle stretch, LSU, Oklahoma, Georgia, and you're saying just find a way to win 2 of those, and you probably find yourself in Atlanta, right? And if you can win all 3, you're talking about possibly a bye week in the playoff if you can manage that, right? So I think Ole Miss is in a really good spot. They're going to have to show that they can put it all together, right? You're going to want to see maybe one more step at a Jackson Dart, be a little bit more dynamic down the field, a little bit more of a game, not just a game manager, but really, breaking things open, being explosive, being a real weapon. You might need to see 2 or 3 guys step up in terms of receiver talent, maybe a backup running back, so that guys can stay rested, stay healthy, and get their reps in. But I mean, outside of that, I think you're really looking at a good squad that can really push for, again, not just the SEC championship, not just a berth in Atlanta, but I mean, should get a playoff spot and should be relatively high ranked, either hosting a playoff game or maybe sneaking up and getting one of those buys.
I think Kentucky's their conference opener. I think they'll handle Kentucky. I think they're going to be physical enough to match up with them, and they're certainly going to be faster than Kentucky. I will say at South Carolina, a team that is built with more speed in mind, and then at LSU, that's a tough back-to-back. Regardless of how good South Carolina is, it's tough to play on the road at Williams-Brice Stadium, and then you've got that look-ahead factor to LSU as well. I would circle those 2 games as maybe a chance for Ole Miss to be a little too high on their own supply. It'll be their first time that we're really playing on the road. They go to Wake Forest. That's not going to be an issue for them. But that'll be their first kind of smelling salts moment. I feel like of the 2024 season at Florida as well. Tough road trip. It's at the end of the season. Who knows what state Florida is going to be in, and it's off a bye week. But I do think finally this team is enough stake and not too much sizzle to where I think you can buy into Ole Miss and be pretty confident. Now, the issue is their over-unders at 9.5. The issue is as we get down to these top 6, 7 teams, not all of them can go 10-2, right? Or 11-1. Like some of these teams have to lose. And I wrote in the preview exactly that. I said, well, you can't just bet the over on all of them. But Ole Miss is one of those teams that I would lock into the over. I feel really good about taking the Rebs.
Well, and even going into kind of what I think their team's mindset is going to end up being this season, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of look ahead or a whole lot of kind of feeling themselves too much. This just seems to be a team that's like kind of pissed off, right? There's not a whole lot of talk about the individuals. Everyone kind of likes Ole Miss as a dark horse, Ole Miss, woo, fun. But even within the conference, like obviously newcomers, Texas, we'll talk about them in a second, getting a lot of hype in the offseason, deservedly so, but it's shadowing over Ole Miss a little bit, right? And everyone's still talking about Bama, Georgia. That's shadowing over Ole Miss. And, they're not really getting all the talk that a lot of people are getting. So it's relatively quiet at Ole Miss right now. You combine that with almost nobody is going to say Jackson Dart's one of the top quarterbacks in the country, despite the fact that he very well might be, right? There's a lot of talk, he's kind of in that fringe Heisman, but they're not really talking in that big terms like, Dart's a guy to look out for. He's a major weapon. Trey Harris, major weapon outside. Like, there's not a whole lot of talk about, a lot of these individual pieces or a lot of this, there's just kind of a lot of, Ole Miss could be a dark horse. And I think that's what's going to kind of motivate them. They seem to have a little bit. You even look at what Lane Kiffin ended up kind of exploding out a little bit against Feinbaum. I think that kind of reflects some of the mindset that's going on in that Ole Miss locker room is, you said this about us and you said we couldn't do this. And, these guys said this about us. Nobody's really talking about us. We'll show you. We're going to get a little angry. And so I think this is going to be a dangerous team just from an anger standpoint. I think a lot of those games are, look out, Ole Miss could, and they're going to come out and beat you by 30. Like, I think that they got that kind of fight in them. I think there's a chance that, when they host Georgia, that could end up being an undefeated versus undefeated where you're looking at this going, this is for all the marbles in the SEC a little bit later in the season. Should be pretty, chilly there in November. It could be a real fun one to watch.
The ACC coming out and saying, we would like our own Paul Feinbaum in this conference after what Kiffin did to him on national television. That was interesting.
If the ACC wants Paul Feinbaum, they can have him.
They can have him.
I will trade you Paul Feinbaum for a bag of chips. Like, just get Paul Feinbaum out of here. I don't want Paul Feinbaum in the SEC anymore, man. He's goofy.
Would you trade him for some Carolina barbecue with that mustard sauce?
I would.
I would trade him for 5 cents and the lint in my pocket. Like, I don't want Paul Feinbaum in the conference anymore, man. He's goofy.
All right.
North Carolina barbecue is not better than Texas barbecue or St. Louis barbecue. It's different. It's kind of its own category, but it is good. And I will not hear North Carolina slander because I can shout down.
Everyone is entitled to their opinion.
Hey, vote in the comments. Vote in the comments, North Carolina fans.
Sure. Tell us which barbecue you prefer. Trey, you were our chief political correspondent in Nashville. You survived the angry Vol Navy. You've made it down to Tuscaloosa, where we've got conflicting opinions on if Kalen DeBoer is going to be the next GOAT following Nick Saban, or if he's going to be an absolute failure in year one. It feels like Alabama expectations are fairly split. I think the failure ones are in the minority, but you listen to a lot of their beat writers and insiders, and Alabama fans still expect an 11-1 season, even those saying 12-0 should be the expectation for Kalen DeBoer.
Yeah, and that's just how high the bar was raised. But the reality is, this is the most intriguing Alabama season maybe of all time. I feel pretty comfortable saying that. And Saban, when he came in, famously went 7-6, lost to ULM in the first season that he was in Tuscaloosa. I'm not calling for that with Kalen DeBoer. Let me be very clear before we start out. But It's going to be very intriguing to see just how everything transitions. By all accounts, Nick Saban has been a wonderful resource for Kalen DeBoer, and it seems like the transition is going as smoothly as it possibly could. Nick even said on SEC Media Days that he has not been in the facility, but he's always been available to talk, and they meet quite often. So I think this is going to be a very interesting team. And I think DeBoer, look, we love Kalen DeBoer on this podcast. We were thrilled when he went to Washington. We thought it was a great hire. The dude wins every single place that he goes. And his performance at SEC Media Days, obviously tons of coaches have talked their way through SEC Media Days and then gone on to flame out on the football field. We could write a book about that. But his performance was very impressive at SEC Media Days. There were a ton of questions. You know, you never coached in the South. You've never been south of, it might have been Kirk Bowles that asked it in a very condescending way. Have you been south of like South Dakota or something like that? But I was very impressed with how he handled those questions, how he handled the pressure of being the Alabama coach at SEC Media Days. Even in Dallas and not in Birmingham, it's still a lot of pressure to handle. But this is a team in Alabama. I think I know that the defense is going to be fine. They lost Caleb Downs, obviously, to that was a huge loss. But the
Ohio
defense,
State.
yeah, it's going to Ohio State. But I think that the defense is going to be fine. I think that Alabama can hang their hat on the defense this year. We've seen that's not going anywhere. I think that tradition is going to carry on from Saban. What I'm really intrigued about, guys, is they lost their top 2 rushers. They lost their top, 3 or 4 pass catchers from last year.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of inexperience coming in to replace them. Lots of good pickups from the transfer portal, but lots of inexperience, young guys coming in to replace them, and guys that are going to get their first shot in this Kalen DeBoer offense. So I'm very fascinated to see the next wave of talent at Alabama. We saw it didn't necessarily transition as smoothly as we thought last year. It took a while for that offense to really get humming. And now you're coming in with a new system, a new offensive coordinator, new play caller, and it's going to be fascinating to see how quickly that gels. And I think that's going to define success for Alabama this year.
I like the secondary for Alabama. I'm curious to know how their front 7 ends up performing this year. Just how they kind of weather that storm. The offense is should be very, very good. I think the reports that, Jalen Milroe wasn't adapting to DeBoer's offense, that he wasn't the guy, that this was really just kind of the incumbent waiting to be ousted by Austin Mack or whoever was coming in DeBoer's either transfer class or high school recruiting. I think all of that was just off-season talk, right? All just.
And I was kind of fanning those flames a little bit.
We were, yeah, we were a little concerned, and there, it made some sense. And then over the course of the last couple of months, the reality set in. Like, no, Milroe's gonna be fine. Is he the perfect quarterback for DeBoer's system? No, probably not. But the Alabama offense, I think, is going to be just fine. I just want to see what the culture is like. I think that more than the X's and O's on the field, I want to see what the culture is like. I want to see what it looks like when Alabama is down by 10 on the road. In the past, like when they were down to Tennessee this past season, I don't know, did many people count Alabama out? Maybe they did, because it was such a weird season for Alabama. But sure enough, Nick Saban finds a way to roar back. The defense clamps down and the offense just goes ham, and they leave Tennessee in the dust, right? Does DeBoer's Crimson Tide have that gear? We're going to figure that out. And I think the most important thing to remember is in year 1, success may not be 11-1. It may be a 9-3, a 10-2 season. It doesn't mean that the ceiling's falling, right? I mean, Alabama is currently winning just about every recruiting battle that they want outside of Oregon. So the future is clearly very, very bright in Tuscaloosa. It's just maybe readjusting those expectations from the greatest coach of all time to a guy who is, 2 quarters away from winning a national championship.
And you've also got to adjust your expectations that you can lose 2, maybe even 3 games and still sneak into the college football playoff and win
Sure
a
can.
national championship. So that's going to be an adjustment for everybody, not just Alabama fans. But you look at their schedule, if they lose to Georgia and they lose at Tennessee, that doesn't mean that they're out of the college football playoff conversation. And they could turn it around. They could get gelled by November and be one of the favorites still entering the college football playoff. So yeah, adjust your expectations. Still, you have championship level talent. You have championship caliber coaching because Kalen DeBoer just took Washington to the national championship game. People forget that in this conversation. He's a man that has won everywhere he's been and took Washington to the national championship game in the year of our Lord 2023, 2024. So I'm long-term buying on Kalen DeBoer. It might be a little bumpy this year to start. Coaching transitions typically are. And it's a really difficult job to follow the greatest of all time. But I do think as soon as they get this, when they figure out who their go-to playmakers are on offense, this offense is really going to be clicking because Jalen Milroe has proven he can run the show.
That schedule does them no favors. You mentioned the Georgia
Tough
game.
schedule.
Yeah, week 4 at Tennessee, home against Missouri, bye week before LSU, which is huge. They go to Death Valley for that. Then they go to Oklahoma and home for the Iron Bowl. So, there might be a couple losses, a couple landmines lurking on that schedule. We'll just have to wait and see. For my money, over unders 9.5. The over is not the betting favorite currently. I think a lot of people are projecting Alabama to go 9-3. I think there's enough talent on this team to where, sure, they're probably going to drop 1 or 2 of these games. But I think a 10-win Alabama team is where I've settled in on this season.
I could definitely see that. I wouldn't overlook the Wisconsin game. The trip up to Camp Randall is going to be very interesting. But you highlighted all the tougher other games. They place a good chunk of the top half of our rankings here, and that's going to be difficult. But I think a lot of people are saying, all right, finally we get to see Alabama face a few more challenges in the regular season. Because let's be honest, they had dominated the SEC West most of the years, and some of those matchups started to get a little stale. And we tried to hype it up. We tried to say, oh, they could slip up here, but now they finally have a schedule that could be tricky.
Let's move into the second team on this list. The Texas Longhorns were 1 play away from playing for a national championship game against Michigan. They will get that matchup against Michigan this year in week 2. Yep, week 2, right after the Colorado State game. Texas is easily one of the most iconic stories this season because finally Texas met expectations last season. They were able to cruise all the way to the semifinal game. Yes, they lost to Oklahoma, but they destroyed Oklahoma State to claim the final Big 12 trophy on their way out of the conference. They've got a ton of explosiveness on offense. They got basically whoever they wanted out of the transfer portal on offense and on defense. My question is, Texas now enters the SEC, where the number one thing that you have to be able to do is stop the run. They lost their best 2 defensive tackles to the NFL draft from a season ago, and that is not a glaring weakness, but the biggest question mark that the Longhorns have. Do they have veterans to fill those defensive tackle spots? Absolutely. But that will not be something that we have the answer to, I think, Garrett, until Donovan Edwards is trying to smash up the middle on a halfback dive on 3rd and 2. The offense, like I mentioned, is loaded for bear. Quinn Ewers will lead that quarterback room. Obviously, Arch Manning waiting in the wings. Cedric Baxter looks like the next best thing at running back for Texas. And they've got wide receivers out wide that are going to make your head spin. Isaiah Bond from Alabama, Matthew Golden from Houston, Silas Bolden from Oregon State. I mean, the speed is going to be outstanding on the 40 acres. One of the best offensive lines in the country as well. It will come down to, can that defensive line get pressure on the quarterback and stop the run for me? That will be the only thing, in my opinion, that keeps Texas from achieving a ceiling, which I think is probably 11 wins this season and a front row seat, maybe the first right of refusal at going to Atlanta behind only Georgia?
I think the ceiling for Texas is probably going undefeated. I think they have everything they need to beat Georgia. The question for me, and this has to do a lot with sort of modern college football, and again, like when you get to the top of the SEC, you really have to nitpick to find the differences. Like when we're talking about the difference between Georgia, Texas, Bama, Ole Miss, even like we're really having to nitpick to find problems, right? And so if you really want to nitpick, they've brought in so much talent to replace guys who are just crazy talented, right? So like I looked up their receiving stats from last year. They lose their top 5 receivers from last season, right? They lose Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, Jatavion Sanders. That's a big one. And, I think you got to ask tight end questions about that as well. And you look down, their returner with the most yards is Gunnar Helm with 192. So that's not great. Obviously, what we just said was they brought in a bunch of guys from the portal. And so the question for me is just, okay, are they going to fit as well with the system? Are they going to understand the system quickly enough? Will they mesh with Quinn Ewers or later in the year, Arch Manning? Who knows what's going to happen to the quarterback spot? That's, a big, head spinning thing. I think Quinn will probably finish the year, obviously, as the starter, but, we'll see, I guess, what happens there. But it's really just about sort of this new age of college football of how quickly can these new pieces come in and fit together, right? Because, if you look at the schedule, it's one of the easier schedules, I think, in the entire SEC. They play like 3 hard conference games, maybe. And outside of that, you play Michigan week 2, which is going to be a big test that they definitely cannot overlook. I know Michigan lost a lot, but if you think you're going to walk into Ann Arbor and just walk out with a blowout win, I think everybody who thinks this one's going to be a blowout either way is very mistaken. I think this one will be a nail biter till the end. But you really get a nice little ramp up, and the SEC did Texas a lot of favors in their first year. Unfortunately for Texas, you get back-to-back, maybe your 2 hardest games on the schedule outside of Michigan, where you play Oklahoma and Georgia back-to-back. That's always a tough rivalry game for them with Oklahoma. Seems like almost every single year that game is, tight no matter how good either team is. And then you have to follow that up with an emotionally draining game. Then you go follow that up with Georgia, right? Maybe the best team in the country. And that's just a really tough 2 games to go back-to-back. Now, there is a world in which they beat Oklahoma and ride that emotional high straight over Georgia, and they steamroll them, and then it's just Texas off to the races. They'll be the number 1 seed for the whole season, right? I think it's more likely that they drop 1 or 2 of those games, depending on how those games end up playing out. Now, again, nitpicking, you're right about the defensive line. I think they'll be all right on the defensive line. I think they'll be able to get to the quarterback, like what they brought in. It's just all about finding your way through the SEC in this first year. They get a really easy schedule. Got to look at that game at Kyle Field. Anything can happen in a rivalry game. We talk about that, across the country, but they should be the better team in that game and should probably win that game. I think this is a very good football team. There's not a whole lot of places where you can really find faults. For me, the biggest thing is just how quickly does the portal get working, and then how quickly can they get everything, from the portal to click into place and really start to win games. Because again, like if you don't get it to click, if your guys haven't figured out their role, week 2 against Michigan could be an upset spot. And who knows what happens to this team if they lose week 2 to Michigan. You get a couple of games up until you can play a game that you feel like matters until you play Oklahoma. Can you get back up for that game? Obviously, they'll play that. It's a hot one, but, it's just kind of figuring out where can they go if they don't prove it early to really prove that they're here and they've established themselves. Or does it kind of spiral a little bit if they do end up losing that week 2 matchup?
By all the statistical and the projection-based analytics, so if you read Phil Steele, if you read Bill Connolly's work, Texas is supposed to take some sort of step back this year. How big of a step back? It's impossible to say. But statistically, they are expected to regress just a little bit this year. I don't know if they can run the table. I think what you just mentioned, the Oklahoma-Georgia back-to-back, that's really the only place that I see them seriously slipping up. Now, could they lose a rivalry game to Texas A&M at the end of the year? Of course they can. Anything can happen in those big rivalry game situations. But that schedule is very, very favorable for them to get on a roll late. The Michigan game is fascinating. We've talked about that game at length. We had a lot of comments on both sides. Texas was going to blow Michigan out. Michigan was going to stuff Texas into a locker at home.
So
I
so
can't
many
wait.
comments that we had to do a second video just to say, hey guys, like this isn't going to be a blowout either way. Don't misconstrue what we were saying. It's not going to be a blowout. This game will probably be like a 3-point game fairly late in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, the score predictions coming in on our YouTube channel were just hilarious in that.
I love the enthusiasm from you guys, but it's a little unhinged sometimes.
a lot of like 45-10, like for
Yeah.
both teams.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be a good game. Texas, as I mentioned, one of the most fascinating stories. A team. I said I had Auburn highlighted, circled, starred as a team to watch this year. I have Texas doing the exact same for this season. Well, there's only one team left in the SEC. That means that the Georgia Bulldogs have been power ranked as the top team in the conference, a team that, guys, didn't make the playoff last year. They lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game. They were one of two teams that were undoubtedly snubbed for a playoff spot, the other obviously being Florida State. Kirby Smart being denied 3 championships in a row seems to have attacked this season with all the more vigor. The offense looks like it's going to be dynamic. Trevor Etienne comes over from Florida to lead that running back room. The wide receivers seem like they're going to be fairly decent this year. And Carson Beck, statistically, is a very good, if not above average quarterback. He certainly throws for enough yards. I think you could maybe get into a debate over how efficient he is and how far down the field he's throwing that ball. But nonetheless, he's a winner between the hedges. Defense is as elite as I think we're going to see in the country this season. Their front four is disgusting. Their secondary is extremely talented. Truly, guys, the only thing standing in Georgia's way is their own players and the inability to hand over their car keys late at night. I mean, that's truly it. As unfortunate as that is, it's the truth. They've had
You
something
ain't wrong.
they've had something like 15 driving related incidents since the incident, I believe was it the beginning of the year in January that claimed the life of a staff member. I mean,
It's been multiple years. It didn't
Yeah,
just
they had issues right after that second championship. That was the one that I was remembering. There was some guys kicked right after that too. So it's not a fun situation, and obviously you don't want to talk about it. But I mean, look, when it's this repetitive, you got to ask a couple questions about culture and whatnot. Like it's what's happening that's allowing that to continue. I don't know. I mean, like I know that the SEC, like it's a common thing that the SEC doesn't take some of that disciplinary stuff seriously. Like a lot of schools throughout the SEC are like, a guy got a DUI. Like, was he really that drunk? Like, there's a lot of schools that'll do that kind of thing. Georgia's got to figure it out a little bit. They've got a little bit of a law problem there in Athens.
I think the offense is going to be perfectly fine. I really am excited about what they've got. London Humphreys comes over from Vanderbilt. Michael Jackson III comes over from USC. Benjamin Urasek comes over from Stanford. He seems like he's not necessarily the Brock Bowers instant replacement. I think those starting reps are going to go to Oscar Delp, but another fantastic tight end that joins that room. The offensive line should be very good as well. They did lose, some players to the draft. One to the transfer portal who is going to go get his master's at Rice. Cooper Lindbergh, I believe is his name. Chad Lindbergh. But all of that can be instantly replaced by the job that Kirby Smart has done recruiting, filling those holes, building Georgia into the best program in the country. And feel free to offer more commentary on that. But I think ultimately the best way to frame this Georgia discussion in their quest for a third national championship in 4 years is looking at the schedule. Clemson's right off the bat in Atlanta. That'll be a fun test. But then this is not an easy schedule for the Georgia Bulldogs. This is certainly going to be, if they're going to win a national championship this year, this is going to be their toughest road to that because they've got at Kentucky, at Alabama. They draw Auburn, of course, at Texas before a bye week. We've talked this entire series about when bye weeks come and how pivotal that is. They get Texas on the back end of a very tough 4-game stretch. They play Florida. They play Ole Miss. They play Tennessee. And then at the very end, they'll play an offensively explosive Georgia Tech. So 2 years ago, we were saying this is the Marsh, or was it last year, 2 years ago, it was the marshmallow schedule of all marshmallows, right? Georgia is just going to walk to a national championship game. And they basically did until they lost to Alabama. And, well, we feel like the committee kind of screwed that playoff system up. This year is a much different test. And this will be the best test, I think, of Kirby Smart's coaching and program building in Athens.
Yeah, no more life in the SEC East. That's really what it comes down to. When you look at why this schedule is much more difficult, I think this is going to be the best, most balanced offense that Kirby has had in his time at Georgia. I think this version of Carson Beck is far and away the best quarterback that he's had in a starting role. We can make the argument about Justin Fields when he was a second string, but this year's version of Carson Beck is the best, most talented, probably best overall quarterback that he's had. And I think this receiving core, not taking Brock Bowers into account, I know they lost Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey last year, and both of those guys are probably going to have really nice NFL careers. I think this receiving core, top to bottom, is the best. When you look at the wide receivers, is the best that he's had, best that Carson Beck has had to throw the ball to. When you look at, bringing in Humphreys from Vandy, Michael Jackson from USC. Oh, no, yeah, you add Trevor Etienne from Florida, who's one of the best running backs in the whole conference last year. So this is going to be a really fun offense. We know the defense is going to be good. There's a lot to like about this Georgia team. There's a reason they have a 10.5 over-under. And they have a tough schedule. They have one of the toughest schedules in the country, but they also have the team to battle that. So I'm not as worried about that as if, they had lost some of those other key pieces or they were rebuilding in a specific position. They're ready to go. They're built for a schedule like this. I love that they're going to get challenged. And again, just like we talked about with Alabama, even if you drop a couple of those games, as long as you're peaking at the right time, you're fine to make a run in December.
Yeah, and I know that, first off, I want to go back and address, I know we didn't just disrespect Stetson Bennett, okay? I like Carson Beck as much
I love Stetson Bennett.
Stetson Bennett passed for 4,000 yards and won 2 championships. So, look, all I'm saying,
4,000 yards over the course of like 7 years.
No, 4,000 yards was in one season. Come on, man.
I'm just kidding.
Let's not disrespect the guy, okay? No, Carson Beck certainly has the higher ceiling, and I think at this point might be the better quarterback. So I had to go stick up for Stetson. Okay,
Flavius has a soft spot in my heart.
Of course, yeah. We know how you feel. It's okay. So no, but the schedule will certainly be tricky. There's kind of two other things for that. So first off, yeah, the schedule's tricky, but this is like the first time he's had the ability to mess up. So like an 11-1 or 10-2 Georgia obviously makes the playoff, right? Like there's no way that a 10-2 Georgia gets left out. There's not going to be
a bunch of some real craziness happening in other conferences.
Right. Well, because you would need a lot of 11-1s or a lot of just undefeated conference champions in like the G5 level or something like that. But like, no matter how they go 10-2 on the schedule, it's going to require at least one big time W. And I think that's going to have to be an issue where, Georgia's going to have to, yes, they're going to have to play well. Yes, they're going to have to get through a schedule, but like, there's not really a situation where Georgia's going to be in a bad spot this year. And you let this team peak and get to a playoff, there's not a lot of other teams that can stand up with them. The other thing that I think is going to be Georgia's like problem though, is they're losing star talent, right? They're losing big time talent. They got maybe a better overall offense. They got maybe, top to bottom, the better teams, but no Brock Bowers, no Ladd McConkey is a big problem for them that they're going to have to fix in the receiving, right? They're going to have to replace some big time players that have been, key pieces that are, easy go-tos, screw it, he's down there somewhere type guys for a couple of years now that, you're not going to have that. And they have talent. Like they have the talent. But same way with, what I just said about Texas needing to prove some of that new talent, like Georgia kind of has to prove it too, right? There's good players, but they got to prove they can do it without that upper absolute top tier talent like you've seen in the past couple of years. So I do think this is an extremely good offense. I think this is going to be an explosive offense that's going to run really well. I'm curious what happens when you get up against that top tier talent. Like when you get up against a Texas or an Alabama, or even if you make it to a playoff and you got to play Ohio State or someone like that, right? What happens when you get up against those top tier teams when you maybe don't quite have the stars that everybody else has, right? And I know Georgia fans are going to tell me about how everybody else is a star too, and all their guys are going to be even better. But like, let's be realistic. Those guys aren't going to be there immediately, and they're going to have to prove it before we can just believe it.
Is Georgia the ultimate horse for course this year in the SEC, or would you pick a different team as your favorite to claim the title?
I'll go with Georgia until proven otherwise. They were right there last year. They should have beaten Alabama. Not how that game turned out, but like on paper, they should have beaten Alabama last year in Atlanta to win the SEC championship last year. If they make it to the playoff, I don't know. That game against Michigan would have been awesome, but
yeah,
it's Georgia until proven otherwise at this point.
Yeah, they just kind of have built such a machine that it's really hard to pick against them. I will say, like, they have to watch out for Texas just because Texas has the light schedule, right? Like, Texas is kind of the big threat to them, I think. And the funny thing is, I think Georgia could possibly beat Texas and still end up, losing the conference to them, either, by last game of the season, actually playing them in the conference championship game, or just not making it because they slip up a couple other places. Like, they're playing at Bama, they're playing at Ole Miss, they're playing at Texas. Those are not easy games, right? You're playing, Tennessee. That's always a hot game that always seems to go, pretty competitive. So, I just don't know with this type of schedule that they can run the gauntlet. They have the talent to do it. They certainly can. I just don't know that they'll be able to. It's kind of the first time they've had to do it. But I don't know. I think really it's Georgia and Texas, and it's pretty neck and neck, if for nothing else but Texas's easy schedule.
I think I would go with Georgia as well right now, Trey, for the same reason. If my rubric for these top 5 teams is who's been groomed, who's been just manicured towards winning in an all-out heat, you got to take the Georgia Bulldogs, right, at this point. Tough schedule, though. If they're able to get through it, like I said, the most impressive job Kirby Smart has done to date. Maybe potentially one of the most impressive coaching jobs and program building results of all time. If this team can go 11-1, 12-0 through this schedule, paid off with a national championship.
Who's y'all's pick for the second team to make it to Atlanta? Let's go on the record.
I'll say Texas.
Okay.
I know I just made the Texas pick for, they could possibly end up there, but for the sake of some parity, I will go ahead and say Ole Miss. I think they got a real easy enough schedule to make it happen, and I think Ole Miss has a real shot at making it to Atlanta this year.
Okay. I will go with Alabama.
Boring. Boo.
Georgia, Alabama.
That's not a boring pick.
I heard Alabama coming out of your mouth when you started the sentence, man. I was like, no, don't say it.
But I love that there's legitimately a discussion for so long it was Georgia, Alabama.
Yeah.
Winning.
And it could be that way this year.
Yeah. LSU could come up and get the West sometimes, but I love it. There's legitimately a huge discussion about who the two teams are going to be.
Yeah.
SEC is going to be a blast this year. We thank you guys for participating, power ranking these teams 16-1. Again, if you've just found us for this part, definitely go back, listen to the first 2 parts. Just looked at the metrics as we were recording this, and y'all are loving the first 2 parts. So we really appreciate that. At 3Tech Pod on all social channels, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, you name it, you can find us. Next up, we've got the Big 12 Conference preview. We can't wait to get into what should be a chaotic conference, a conference that could legitimately have 10 possible options as a champion. It's going to be beautiful. We're going to break it down with you next week, and we can't wait to have you be a part of it as well. For Trey Reeves and Garrett Turney, I'm Mitch Mason. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. Until next time, so long, everybody.
Gracious, how about